Tensions are still high in Syria. We had the invasion by Turkey, the temporary ceasefire. ISIS once had a stronghold in part of that country. Assad, the dictator, is still trying to keep his control. And of course, there are other countries trying to get influence as well. And the U.S. has played a role in all of this, as you know. But what started all of this? Where did this division come from? And is there any hope for peace in the future? Well, I'm bringing on an expert right now on this subject. He's the Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. He's also a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel. And Dakota Wood joins me right now.
Yeah, a real pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
So before we get into the subject at hand, I did want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your background, what's your expertise, and what do you do for the Heritage Foundation?
Right. Well, 20 years in the Marine Corps, retired in 2005, and then since then I've remained involved in national security and national defense sorts of issues, everything from assessing competitions with the country and operational concepts. As a strategist for Marine Corps Special Operations Command for about a year or so, and then I've been here at the Heritage Foundation almost 6 years. And what we do is try to inform the public discussion about national security and military affairs. Target audience is really Capitol Hill because they enact legislation, right, that affects all of these things and provides the money and legal authorities to do so, but also to inform the American public. We have dramatic debates over involvement of U.S. military capabilities and what we're trying to accomplish in the world and in terms of national interest. And so we try to be as nonpartisan, facts-based, historically rooted as possible, and that's why I really enjoy programs like yours.
Yep, and that is definitely the goal here. And today I wanted to bring you on because I think some people just might be confused when they hear everything that's going on in the Middle East, especially Syria. We recently, the big news obviously was Turkey wanting to invade a portion of Syria near the border, kind of pushing the Kurds out. A lot of Republicans in Congress were upset about this, saying we had abandoned the Kurds. Actually, a lot of Democrats were upset at that as well. But my question is, how did we get here? Why did Turkey decide to do this in the first place?
It actually has its roots in the 1920s, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, way back in the World War I, in the 1910s or so. The treaties that resulted from World War I, one of those dealt with the elimination or the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the modern state of Turkey. So back then, you had the Kurdish people who have inhabited this region for centuries, which stretches across the modern borders of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and a little bit up into Iran, if I recall. And they were hoping for a homeland, a Kurdistan. The European powers, when they carved up the map in that area and created places like Saudi Arabia and whatnot, did not include them in a homeland for the Kurds. And so you have the modern state of Turkey, the modern state of Syria, and the modern state of Iraq. So the Kurds have really been trying to live as an autonomous people in this modern context of these nation states. And there's been a long-running battle between more aggressive elements of the Kurdish people. Today, one group known as the PKK, that's its three-letter acronym, has been identified by our own State Department as a terrorist element because of its tendency to bomb Turkish police stations and, take those folks under fire. So the Turkish government has a problem with this renegade group, in their mind, in southeastern Turkey. And this clash has been going on for decades. So today, with the civil war that erupted in Syria more than half a dozen years ago, it really upended things. And you had a lot of groups like various elements of the Kurds, but also various Islamist elements like factions of Al-Qaeda. Islamic State is the one that's hit the news, but you had other groups as well, all battling each other to try to claim dominance in some part of the territory that we know as Syria. And because the Kurds in Syria are involved and they have relationships with the other Kurdish peoples in Iraq and in Turkey, the Turks view this as all one if not homogenous group, then a self-identified group. So they view the PKK as a terrorist element. The fact the PKK draws support from the largest Kurdish people, a larger Kurdish population, they then extend that view of the Kurds down into Syria. Turkey, oftentimes at odds with the government of Syria. The more Sunni identification of Erdogan and many Turks there in Turkey is at odds with the Alawite, which is a subset of the Shia branch of Islam. Those set up contests. So you have Turkey against the government of Syria, Erdogan against Bashar al-Assad, and so it's just mayhem in that region. And everybody is trying to protect their interests or to advance their interests. And so really it shouldn't be any surprise that Turkey trying to push back the Kurds, both in Turkey and in Syria, and create this buffer zone is an opportunity for them because of the disorder that exists in the modern state of Syria. And that disorder clearly gave rise to groups or opportunities for the rise of groups like Islamic State. At one time, it controlled half of Syria and a third of Iraq and constituted almost a proto-state. And the United States and other European powers assessed that it was potentially a serious threat to their homelands, up through France and Germany and Italy and England and even to the United States. And so we got involved to try to find partners in the region that could combat the Islamic State. The Kurds were very effective fighters, somewhat stable politically, and so we lent our air power and various forms of expertise to make them more effective in defeating the Islamic State. And so that's what drew us into that conflict on the ground and in the skies over Syria. And as you have already indicated, the debate now raging is, to what extent does the United States continue to be involved? And do we remain involved with the Kurds even as they are battling Turkey and the government of Syria?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier as well, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill were really upset when Trump decided to pull troops out of the region. Why were they upset?
Well, I think it's domestic politics. If either Republicans or Democrats in Washington, D.C. were truly serious about supporting the Kurds as a people, it would not have been a decision a week ago, withdraw U.S. support. I mean, we would have been, doing something more aggressively. And if you'll recall, even during the Obama administration and then bleeding over into the Trump administration, the fact that we were actually placing troops on the ground in Syria was very controversial. We shouldn't get mired in these intractable civil wars. What are the objectives? It's interventionist. And so there was pushback from both sides of even getting involved in the first place. And Obama was heavily criticized for allowing a red line to pass. Remember Bashar al-Assad and the use of chemical munitions and stuff.
Right.
So
President Trump criticized him for that.
Oh, absolutely. So there's been this resistance to getting involved. But Islamic State comes up. We do get involved in trying to beat that thing back, right? And we're largely successful in doing so. I mean, we didn't kill everybody, and that wasn't the goal, but to eliminate it as a proto-state, serious land-owning, military power with brutal terrorist tendencies. So that was accomplished. So it's very odd that now that goal has been achieved, and that President Trump wants to pull things back, something he has been talking about for 3 years, that you're seeing this chorus of we're betraying partners and allies and that sort of thing. So I think what happens in the American social setting is that we have very big hearts. We want to help others that we see that are under attack. We feel that folks should have a homeland and not, fear for, their own safety. And you have more aggressive regimes like Turkey and certainly the Syrians who are, kind of beating down and attacking. And, you see women and children and homemakers and shopkeepers, that are all under attack. And we want to do something, to correct that. We feel a moral obligation to step in and try to negotiate a peaceful settlement where everybody is happy. Unfortunately, the world just doesn't work like that in many ways. And so The president has talked to his advisors. He's talked to Congress about the necessity to draw down U.S. involvement in the Middle East. He's talked about the fact that these various states and groups, Syria, Turkey, the Kurds, all these folks who live in that region and have for centuries need to figure out their own solutions. And if the U.S. gets involved in every one of these scrapes, whether it's the Middle East or Africa or Asia or elsewhere, we'll be viewed as interventionist and warmongering and all that. So he gets tired of waiting on good options. In his frustration and knowing that a presidential election cycle has come up, he says, that's it. You guys aren't giving me any good options, you guys being Congress or the Pentagon or his advisors. I'm pulling the plug and unilaterally declaring that we're withdrawing. And then you see a lot of this scrambling now going on to say, well, what is the impact on the U.S. reputation? Are we leaving people hanging out to dry? Are we going to lose situational awareness in really a critical region, for global commerce and energy support or energy supplies and all that? So the current criticism, I believe, is a function of domestic politics at the moment, but it really is an outlier with respect to U.S. involvement in the region and the nature of that region extending back decades, if not centuries.
I'm speaking with Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation, Dakota Wood, also a retired Marine Colonel or Lieutenant Colonel, Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel. And we have just over a minute left, Dakota. But when we come back, and you can start about it a little bit, but it seems like I hear a lot of people in Congress also say there's a national security interest in us staying there because of ISIS.
Well, there's always the potential of some terror attack like 9/11. I mean, it just stays in the American memory, right? So nobody wants to see nearly 3,000 Americans killed in some kind of a terrorist attack. But, threats have different qualities and different magnitudes. So a terrorist attack on a shopping mall, horrific incident. A nuclear-armed competitor, like China, that can cut us out of an entire part of the globe, is a different order of magnitude. We were concerned about the Soviet Union, Russia in particular, during the Cold War because of the nuclear contest going on. So I think we've lost a sense of what manageable risk is and whether a threat is kind of an acute short-term thing or whether it's a longer-term profound thing that affects America's way of life.
And we will continue this we will continue this discussion in just a moment as I speak with Dakota Wood with the Heritage Foundation. And we're discussing Syria, Turkey, and the Middle East. What role does the U.S. play in this region? And how do we prevent future terrorist attacks? Does us being over there actually do that? I'm speaking with Dakota Wood right now. He's a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel, also Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. And Dakota, I really appreciate you coming on with us today and trying to help us understand all the complex stuff that's going on in the Middle East.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if the world was a simple place? Very on or off, black or white, what have you.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just the complexity, and it has deep historical roots, that within Islam, the fight between Shia and Sunni goes back to, the 7th century. So we just see current manifestations with new technologies and motivations and the rise of actors.
Yeah, and a lot of people that were against pulling troops out of Syria said they were against it not only because they felt like we were abandoning our allies, the Kurds, but I heard a lot of people saying that ISIS is going to make a resurgence. I think General Mattis said that. Petraeus said that. Is that actually a possibility now?
Well, anything's possible, and I don't mean to be dismissive. I mean, there is the possibility, but you can't really predict the future. I mean, there are trends, and you can kind of feel some certainty in forecasting things. And General Mattis, Secretary of Defense former Mattis, has been well-schooled in history, and it feels fairly confident in his assessment of situations as they unfold. But I think it's important to recall that the Islamic State was able to take root because of the mayhem of the Syrian civil war, when it was like 70, 75 identified groups that were all at each other's throats. And so where you have chaos, there is opportunity if you're the more aggressive, violent group, to carve out a section. But over time, over the past half a dozen years, the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, with Russian support, has been able to lay greater claim to the territory that he did not previously control there in central and eastern Syria. So there really isn't a fertile ground for Islamic State to reconstitute itself as it was 3 years ago or thereabouts. So you still have fighters, they still have local leaders, they're still going to contest control of various roads and towns and those sorts of things. But I just don't think the conditions currently exist for them to come back in the strength that they were previously. And as we were talking before, can these areas serve as sanctuaries? Can these groups act as sponsors of terrorism that is exported to other areas, like here coming to the United States? And that is a long-standing concern. We don't want to see a terror group get training, funding, motivation, be animated by increased prestige, that they're attacking these larger powers like the United States. So we don't want to see that, and that's really the primary argument you have for remaining involved in Afghanistan, as an example. But I think that the conditions have changed such that the Russians, the Syrians, the Iraqis, who are more capable than they were half a dozen years ago, none of them want to see the reemergence of a caliphate, that's controlled by the Islamic State. So I just think that there are other factors in play that mitigate that threat, and where the United States should be focusing is on the geostrategic context. Are there states and governments that we can work with, even if we revile them? Do we want to stay mired in that mess? Or we would rather have somebody like Russia, take on that burden. You want to be involved in Syria, have at it, and that's what the president has said, and we'll see how that works out. So these people that are asking for influence in that region should be careful of what they're asking for, because they're going to get a lot more than what they think they were expecting.
Now, we talked about before how President Trump really did want to pull troops out of Syria because he felt like there were no good options. But I have also heard talk that we still have a presence there to secure the oil fields. Mm-hmm. What's that all about?
Oil is revenue, right? So if I can get oil and I can sell it on the market, either the illicit, the above-board market or the black market, it gets money into my coffers, and I can use that to support widows, or I can buy weapons or influence. I can bribe officials. So money equals wealth. Wealth equals effectiveness, capabilities, and influence. So in these eastern oil fields that are a bit out of the range of reach of Bashar al-Assad and the government of Syria, the question now is, well, who gains control of those things? So if the United States isn't there, it becomes a fight between potentially Islamic State or other actors, or Syrian forces or Kurdish forces. And right now the Kurds have ownership. They're there and present. And if they have access or control of that oil, then they can use that to fill their bank accounts and help support their way of life and their causes. The people who are saying that is a reason to maintain a U.S. presence say it's better for the Kurds to have control of those oil fields than a reconstituted Islamic State or Bashar al-Assad. And so it could be an excuse or a reason to maintain a minimal U.S. force presence. 200 people aren't going to guard oil fields, but the 200 people have radios that can call in American air support and artillery support and overwhelm any small ground force of irregular fighters that might try to seize control. So that's one of these, maybe it's a face-saving thing, maybe it's a legitimate, well-intended purpose for continued U.S. involvement, where you're assisting the Kurds in a revenue-generating enterprise, and it also maintains a relationship that gives us situational awareness, the ability to collect intelligence, so that we are forewarned if something bad is arising in that particular region.
Now, speaking of that particular region, we've been focusing a lot on Turkey and Syria, but Saudi Arabia has been in the news recently because they have a spat going on in Yemen with Iran, and then it appears Iran attacked their oil fields. And I heard that we're now sending troops to Saudi Arabia to protect the oil fields. So why is that?
Well, the United States is effectively energy independent. We're a net exporter of energy, because of the investments we've made in shale and fracking and all those things, even as controversial as they are. So we're not dependent on exports per se out of the Middle East, but the rest of the world is. And energy is a fungible commodity, so if the cost of producing something because of the energy used increases in Japan or Korea or in Europe someplace, it affects prices globally in the global market. So when you look at the Arabian Peninsula and the amount of oil that comes out of that region, there is an interest in stabilizing that market so that downstream, literally and figuratively, we don't see increased prices on U.S. goods in our stores here, or our ability to affect trade with other markets. So there's an indirect linkage that affects our economy back home based on the price of oil coming out of the Middle East. And anytime you have these attacks, you see a spike in oil price because risk increases. And so it has a ripple effect across the global economy. So there's this idea that in the contest between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between the Shia in Iran and the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia, Persians versus Arabs, it's easier for us to work with Saudi Arabia, certainly, than it is with Iran. And so we have an economic interest and a partnership interest in helping to defend the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, not out of some kind of goodwill gesture, but because it's an investment in stabilizing economic interests and trade interests that ultimately affects jobs and prosperity here back in the U.S.
I'm speaking with Dakota Wood right now. He's Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation. We have just under a couple of minutes here, but when I hear you talk about the situation in Saudi Arabia, just like you said, I feel like we're never going to get out of the Middle East. Do you see any possibility that the United States can just pull out of the Middle East entirely anytime soon?
Well, we talked about the energy piece, but there is also the specter of a region in war, and then what kind of refugee crisis does that generate, right? So is some level of investment in military capabilities and involvement in the messiness, the unsatisfactory aspect of always being embroiled, is that a lower cost than if things just erupted in all-out war and you saw this flood of humanity out of the Middle East up into Europe? How does that affect political stability?
Yeah, which we already kind of saw after the Syrian civil war.
Absolutely. I mean, Turkey's been dealing with a little over 3.5 million Syrian war refugees in Turkey. Jordan has something like 1 million, which is a significant part of their population right now. We see the mayhem that affects states like Israel. So this crisis on a large scale percolates out, and you see increased security threats. You can see combatants now that have experience or an axe to grind, terrorism that goes into these other regions. And so the thought is a small investment now relative to a catastrophe like that helps to prevent that sort of thing, and it's just the cost of doing business.
Dakota Wood with the Heritage Foundation, I really appreciate you coming on the show today and informing us on this complex situation in Syria and the rest of the Middle East. And hopefully I'll bring you on again soon. Thank you so much.
Really look forward to it. Thanks for having me.